Well, joining me now, Chad Wolf, former acting Secretary of Homeland Security under President Trump and America First Policy Institute Executive Director. So let's talk about these numbers. Griff Jenkins just reported that we have encountered people from 109 different countries. I think he mentioned 322,000 people. Can we actually vet that many people that are coming across the border, or are there inevitably going to be drug traffickers, human traffickers, and terrorists that get through the system into the country that we have no idea who are coming in?
Well, absolutely. Embedded in that flow of individuals are certainly public safety threats and national security threats. And again, the numbers that you're showing there, I think it's important to remember, those are just the individuals that Border Patrol actually encounters. There are thousands and thousands of individuals that we call gotaways that slip between Border Patrol every single day, and it's probably somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 every single day, or sorry, every single month that are getting past Border Patrol. So those are the really scary individuals in some sense of the word. These are individuals that don't want to get caught, don't want to have that interview with a law enforcement officer. But to your point, the CBP, Border Patrol officers are stretched so thin that they're not doing these basic interviews, and they're not doing that law enforcement work that gathers that intelligence that they dramatically need to secure that border. And they're simply not doing that because they're processing more and more migrants every single day, and they don't have the time or the resources to do their law enforcement mission.
Chad, I think what's fascinating or troubling for the American people, not fascinating, troubling, is they think their government is there to protect them and enforce our laws. And when Joe Biden at the southern border is fighting to lift remain in Mexico, the last vestige of a system from the Trump era that would actually send people out of our country back to Mexico, they're trying to get rid of it. I guess I don't understand the strategy. Is this truly an administration that's trying to tell the American people one thing, listen, we're trying to secure the border, but in reality, they want open borders and anyone across the world that wants to come to our country can actually come in? Is that the strategy?
Well, I think that's absolutely clear. It's as if the administration either doesn't care or they're not trying, or maybe it's a combination of both. But what's clear is that the policies that they have along that border are not putting Americans first. Instead, they are leaving the border wide open. You're having historic numbers that we see each and every month. Every month breaks a previous historic record from the previous month, and it just keeps going on and on and on. And so you think at some point the administration would reverse course. They would say our strategy is failing, but instead they double down on it. And each month it gets worse and worse and worse. And I think most Americans are saying, when is this going to end? When can we have a secure border that's processed and under control? And I would say right now, you're not going to have that under the Biden administration unless they change policy and they get back to policies that work, that we know what works. And there's a long list of them that we left for them at the end of the Trump administration.
Yeah, and when they were talking about policies that work, remember Kamala Harris was one who was saying we have to look at root causes in the Northern Triangle countries of Central America. Well, people aren't just coming from those countries any longer. As I mentioned before, they're coming from 109 different countries. But it's also been 1 year since Kamala Harris, again, the border czar, made her first and her last trip to the southern border. What has changed over the course of the last year since Kamala was last down at the border?
Well, it's gotten worse. It's gotten worse. There's no other way to put it. There's more illegal apprehensions. There's more crime. Everything has just gotten demonstrably worse over time. And I think it's a great point. If she wants to focus on the root causes of migration with Central America, that's fine. But those three countries are no longer the driving force of who shows up at that border, because as you indicated, over 120 different nationalities are showing up along that border. So if she wants to focus on the root causes, that's about 30 to 35% of the problem. The problem is they've sent a signal to the rest of the world that if you want to come into the United States illegally and stay in the United States, you do so across that southern border. And so we are seeing nationalities from all over the world and all over the globe come across that border, and that's where we need to get back to enforcing the rule of law, making sure that there is a deterrent in our legal or illegal apprehensions, and return these individuals back if they do not have a legal right to be here in the United States.
Chad, I want you to explain the paroling process to me, if you would, because Border Patrol paroled more than 50,000 migrants in May, and that was a 28% increase from April. Is that a discretionary play from the administration, paroling people? But 50,000 migrants were paroled as opposed to those folks actually being sent back? How does that process work?
Well, parole is supposed to be used on a case-by-case basis to parole individuals into the country that maybe don't have the time to go through the process. And so what we usually find are individuals that need urgent medical attention to get into the United States at a particular hospital or facility here. And so you will parole them into the country. They'll get their treatment and then they'll leave. But it's very clear. The law says it needs to be on a case-by-case basis. And so when you see that they've paroled up to 50,000 or even higher in some instances, that is not on a case-by-case basis. They are paroling whole classes of individuals into the country, and I think that's a gross misinterpretation of their discretionary power at the end of the day. And I know there's some existing lawsuits that are going through the court system now, but we saw this during the Obama administration, and now we're seeing this again during the Biden administration. They're abusing some of their discretionary authorities to remake the immigration system, and that's a direct quote from the DHS secretary, saying that they are trying to re-envision the immigration system, and they're doing it using unique authorities in law given to them by Congress.
It's unbelievable. They've just completely opened up the border and letting everybody in. I have a hard time watching it, Chad. It's so disturbing to see all the people come into the country, and the fact that we have no control of it, I think not just makes me mad, but I think it makes every single American angry that we have an administration who doesn't care about our laws. Chad Wolf, thanks for joining me. I appreciate it.